On May 14, 1984, Eli Mercer buried a blue 55-gallon barrel beside his barn in Adair County, Missouri. He dug until the clay turned cool and dark, lowered the barrel into the hole, and packed dirt around its bottom third. Then he connected a length of black pipe from the barn gutter and stood there with one hand on his shovel. The barrel looked ridiculous. It leaned slightly toward the pasture, its blue paint scratched white in places, a faded company logo still visible beneath the mud. 11 more barrels waited beside the barn, lined up like soldiers nobody had ordered. From the other side of the fence, Roland Pike watched with a cigarette between his teeth. Roland was 47, farmed 240 acres, and believed a farm ought to look clean from the county road. "What are you doing, Eli?" he called. "Catching water." Roland looked up at the cloudless sky. "Water's already got a place to go." Eli drove the shovel into the ground again. He didn't explain himself. By the end of the week, people in Novinga had heard about the barrels. Some said Eli had gotten strange after his father died. Some said his wife had bought him a book about gardening. The men at the feed store laughed gently, not out of cruelty, but because a grown farmer burying barrels beside a barn looked like the beginning of a bad decision. Eli heard about it and kept working. They were about to find out who had made the bad decision. If stories of patience, family, and quiet country wisdom means something to you, subscribe and join our farming family. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, Eli Mercer had not come from people who chased foolish ideas. His great-grandfather, Thomas Mercer, broke ground on the farm in 1911. He came from Iowa with a team of mules, a cross-cut saw, and $3 sewn into the lining of his coat. The first house stood where the machine shed stood later. The first field was only 10 acres, cleared from oak and hickory. Thomas's son, Harlan, added the north pasture during the Depression. He planted corn, raised hogs, and repaired almost everything with wire and patience. By 1984, the farm covered 118 acres. 64 acres went into corn and soybeans. 14 were cut for hay. The rest held pasture, woods, a small orchard, and a creek that ran behind the house before joining the Chariton River miles to the east. The house was white clapboard with green shutters and a porch that leaned slightly toward the creek. The red barn had been built in 1947 with a metal roof that rang like a kettle when rain came hard. Eli was 38 years old. He had a narrow face, strong wrists, and a habit of rubbing his thumb along the side of his forefinger whenever he was thinking. He watched more than he spoke. His wife, Ruth, was 35 and kept the books at the feed store in Kirksville. She could identify a bad tractor belt by sound and knew exactly how long Eli could afford to leave a repair unfinished before it became an expensive repair. Their daughter Anna was 16. Their son Ben was 12. Anna wanted to become a veterinary technician. Ben wanted to do anything that did not involve pulling weeds. Eli understood both positions. He loved the farm, but he did not romanticize it. In 1977, a late frost killed half the orchard bloom. In 1980, a bank loan nearly took the north pasture. In 1982, a bearing failed inside the combine, with 12 acres of soybeans still standing. Eli had a temper with machinery. He once threw a wrench through the open door of the machine shed, missed the wall and broke a window instead. Ruth found him sitting on an overturned bucket afterward. "Feel better?" she asked. "No, that's good." "Means you know it was stupid." The farm's worst problem was not machinery, it was water. The eastern slope fell gently toward the creek, but the ground was uneven. After heavy rain, water came off the barn roof, across the yard, and into the field in one fast sheet. The slope was not steep enough to frighten anyone. That was what made it dangerous. There were no dramatic cliffs of exposed soil. No gully large enough to swallow a tractor, just thin brown lines. A little soil moved every time it rained. A little more when the field was bare. A little more when the ground was hard from summer traffic. By 1983, Eli could see pale clay appearing along the lower edge of the eastern field. One evening in January, he walked the slope after a cold rain. The ground made a soft sucking sound beneath his boots. Water gathered in the tire tracks and ran toward the creek, carrying fine soil with it. Eli crouched and touched the muddy water. There was more field in that creek than there should have been. His grandfather Harlan was 79 then and lived in a narrow brick house behind the Methodist church. Before his knees stiffened, Harlan had worked as a cabinet maker. He kept walnut scraps, bent nails, old screws, broken hinges, and every tool that might someday become useful again. His back room smelled of sawdust and coffee. In a filing cabinet beneath a stack of tax receipts, Harlan kept an old University of Missouri Extension bulletin from April 1937. Its cover was yellow, and the pages were soft at the corners. The bulletin described ways farm families could collect roof runoff for gardens, livestock, and household chores. It recommended gutters, covered storage, screened openings, and overflow routes that carried excess water towards stable, grass-covered ground. One sentence had been marked in pencil: water is easiest to control. Before it gathers speed. Eli read it at the kitchen table while Harlan sharpened a plain blade. I'm thinking about putting barrels around the barn, Eli said. Harlan did not look up. For drinking. For the garden. Washing tools. Maybe the cattle during dry weeks. Barrels won't save a foolish farmer. I know. Harlan ran the blade across the stone, but a careful farmer might save himself some hauling. That was the beginning. The science behind Eli's idea was not mysterious. It was just easy to overlook. A roof collects rain quickly because metal and shingles absorb very little. 1 inch of rain falling on 1,000 square feet of roof can produce more than 600 gallons of runoff. After allowing for splash evaporation and the first dirty water that washes dust and bird droppings from the surface, Eli's 12 barrels could hold only 660 gallons. They would not stop a flood. They would not refill a dry pond. They would not turn a poor farm into a rich one. But they could catch the first rush of water, store some of it for later use, and slow the flow before it reached the yard and the field. The clean roof water could be kept separate from manure and mud. That mattered. Runoff from a barn roof was not the same as runoff through a livestock lot. Eli fitted gutters along the south side of the barn and ran short pipes into the barrels. He placed screens over the openings to keep leaves and mosquitoes out. The first dirty runoff from every storm went onto gravel instead of into storage. The barrels were never for drinking water. He used them for the garden, washing equipment, and a trough for the cattle. For the overflow, Eli dug a broad, shallow channel that followed the natural shape of the hill. He seeded it with orchard grass, smooth brome, and timothy. He did not make a sharp ditch. A steep ditch makes water faster. A wide-grassed waterway gives water room to spread, slows its movement, and protects the soil with living roots. Then Eli changed the fields. Instead of driving straight up and down the slope, he worked across its contour. He left more stalks and leaves on the soil after harvest. He planted cereal rye on the worst section, where bare ground had always washed first. The barrels were what people noticed. The soil work was what would matter. The first attempt failed in 3 different ways. The first 3 barrels smelled like industrial soap. Eli had bought them cheap from a bottling plant near Kirksville, but no amount of scrubbing removed the sharp chemical odor. He hauled them to the scrap yard. The second failure came in June. A thunderstorm tore the gutter loose from the barn and sent water crashing against the wall. 1 barrel rolled down the slope, crossed the garden, and came to rest upside down in the weeds. Ben found it first. "Dad," he called, "your barrel escaped." Eli walked down, lifted it, and inspected. The dent in the side. Looks like it got tired. He repaired the gutter and drove. Longer stakes into the ground. The third failure belonged to a yearling bull. The animal rubbed his neck against the wooden stand holding the nearest barrel until the stand cracked. The barrel fell, the pipe snapped, and more than 100 gallons of stored water rushed across the yard. Ben came running from the chicken shed. The bull broke yaw. Water. Eli looked at the mud. Around his boots. Then we fixed the water. He built stronger stands from treated oak and fenced the entire row. Ruth watched him work until sunset. The air smelled of wet wood, manure, and crushed clover. Mosquitoes rose from the grass in small clouds. "You could have bought a tank," she said. "I could have. It would have been cheaper. Not this one." She looked at him. Eli tightened a bolt. He meant the lesson. By 1986, the barrels had become part of the farm. They filled quickly during spring storms and emptied slowly during July heat. The garden stayed alive longer than it had before. Ruth washed vegetables and tools without hauling buckets from the creek. Eli used stored roof water in the cattle trough during dry spells. The field changed more slowly. That was the trouble with good work. It rarely looked impressive at first. The rye roots held the surface together. Crop residue kept the soil cooler. The grassed waterways softened the flow from the upper field. Earthworms appeared beneath the straw. After a hard rain, the creek still rose. But the water leaving Mercer Hollow carried less brown sediment. Roland Pike noticed. He did not say anything. One afternoon, Roland stopped at the fence while Eli was checking the lower field. Roland wore his grey cap and a denim jacket with a tear at the elbow. "You're growing weeds in your corn," he said. "Cover. Crop? Looks like weeds. Sometimes they do," Roland pointed at the grass channel. "You planning to mow that? When it needs it. Looks unfinished." Eli studied the watermarks along the channel. "It isn't finished." Roland shook his head and walked back toward his truck. He believed straight. Rose meant straight thinking. Then came the drought. In 1988, the sky turned the color of old brass. For 6 weeks, the afternoons were bright and still. The creek shrank to a dark ribbon between stones. The pond behind the house cracked along its edges. Eli's barrels did not save the farm. They were never meant to, but they gave the garden enough water to survive. They kept the calves supplied. They allowed Ruth to wash clothes without carrying buckets from the creek. The rye and residue kept the ground cooler. The contour rows held what little rain came. By September, Roland's upper fields were grey and powdery. Eli's eastern slope was tired, but it was still covered. That was the first time Roland stopped laughing. The second time came in April 1991. Nearly 4 inches of rain fell overnight. A culvert plugged with sticks. Water crossed Roland's lower field in a straight brown sheet and opened a gully deep enough to hide a wheelbarrow. At Mercer Hollow, the barrels filled. Their overflow ran into the grassed waterway. The contour rows slowed the water and spread it across the slope. There was erosion, but not a wound. Eli spent the morning clearing leaves. From the barrel screens, he didn't explain himself. That was his way. The real test arrived. 2 years later, in June 1993, rain began falling on a Monday and kept falling through Wednesday. By the middle of the week, Adair County had received more than 8 inches. The soil was already full. The creek had climbed over its banks. Old Harlan sat in his pickup at the edge of the pasture, with the window cracked open. He was 88 by then. His hearing was poor, but his weather sense remained sharp. He watched barn swallows fly low beneath the porch roof. The cattle pressed together under the cottonwoods. Even the chickens refused to leave the shed. Harlan looked west. The clouds had turned green behind the trees. "Move the calves," he said. Eli glanced at the sky. "Tonight, before dark." Harlan pointed toward the creek. "That water's got somewhere to go." Eli moved the calves to the upper lot. He checked the gates, cleared the screens, and walked the grassed waterway with a flashlight. The ground felt soft under his boots. Nothing more could soak in. That was the danger. When soil is saturated, the question is not whether water will move. The question is how fast and where. At midnight, the storm arrived. Rain struck the barn roof so hard it drowned out the radio. Wind drove water beneath the doors. The barrels filled in minutes, their lids ticking under the downpour. At 1:20 in the morning, the creek left its banks. At 1:45, the road near the Pike farm began to wash out. By daylight, Roland's lower field was under brown water. Corn stalks lay flat in the current. Fence posts leaned downstream. A section of his driveway had broken away and landed against a neighbor's fence. Across the hill, Mercer Hollow looked beaten but whole. The grassed waterway carried a steady ribbon of water without cutting through its banks. The contour strips broke the flow into long, shallow bands. The crop residue held the soil in place. The barrels stood beside the barn. Half covered in muddy spray, they had not stopped the flood. They had helped keep the farm from adding to it. Roland arrived near noon in a wet canvas coat. He walked past the barrels without looking at them. Then he climbed the eastern slope. Eli followed. From the top they could see both farms. The pike fields were streaked with exposed clay and yellow sand. Mud lay in flat fans at the bottom of the slope. At Mercer Hollow the soil was dark, rough, and covered with broken straw. Water moved through the field, but it moved slowly. For several minutes, the only sound was the creek. Roland kept his hands in his pockets. Then he said, "I was wrong." Eli looked at him. Roland nodded toward the barn. "About those two, maybe." Roland gave him a tired look. "Don't make me say it twice." Eli almost smiled. Nobody made a speech about it. The floodwater fell over the next 3 days. The road reopened. State crews replaced the broken culvert. Newspapers printed photographs of flooded bottoms and washed-out bridges. On the Mercer farm, Eli cleaned mud from the barrel screens and reset 2 stones along the grassed waterway. He did not put up a sign. The following spring, Roland brought home 6 blue barrels from the same bottling plant in Kirksville. He did not explain why. Marlene Voss, the 42-year-old county extension agent, visited Mercer Hollow with a clipboard and muddy boots. She measured the barn roof, checked the overflow route, and reminded Eli to keep livestock away from the clean storage water. Howard Bell, a 71-year-old retired cabinet maker, built wooden stands for 4 families along the county road. He used oak scraps and galvanized screws. He charged only for the screws. The millers planted rye on their lower slope. The carters rerouted their barnyard runoff. The Pike family reshaped a grassed waterway and stopped letting bare soil run straight toward the creek. It just spread, the way useful things do, not through an announcement, through a visit. One person saw a garden still green in August. Another saw a hillside that did not wash away. Somebody asked how much the barrels cost. Somebody else asked where the pipe came from. By 1998, Eli had 24 barrels on the farm. Some were blue, some white, and one had faded to the color of old bone. The system had expanded into 2 small storage tanks, a fenced livestock watering point, contour strips, and a grassed waterway that held its shape after storms that once would have carved it open. But Eli was tired. He was 52 years old. His knees hurt after a day on the tractor. Ruth's hands ached from years of bookkeeping. Enna had moved to Columbia and worked as a veterinary technician. Ben had no interest in taking over the farm. The Mercer family decided to sell. The auction took place on a cold Saturday in November. Frost silvered the grass around the barn. The sky was pale and clear, and each breath showed white in the air. Neighbors came for the equipment first. They looked over the John Deere tractor, the hayrake, the cultivator, the pressure washer, and the old combine that had finally earned its rest. Coffee steamed in paper cups. Boots scuffed across frozen ground. The barrels were not on the auction list. Eli had drained them, cleaned them, and lined them beside the barn. A man from Kirksville offered $15 for the whole row. Roland Pike stood near the gate. He was 61 by then. His hair had gone mostly gray, and the bill of his cap had softened with age. The auctioneer moved on to the farm itself. The opening bid was $150,000. No one spoke. The house needed work. The barn roof sagged near the western corner. The farm was only 118 acres, and the eastern fields had never been pushed for maximum yield. The auctioneer tried again. $150,000. Who'll give me that? Roland raised his hand. The number climbed. At $175,000, a land investor from Columbia dropped out. At $182,000, another bidder stepped away. At $186,000, only Roland and a developer from Kirksville remained. The developer wanted the farm for its road access and creek frontage. Roland wanted something else. The auctioneer called for the next bid, 188. Roland raised his hand. The developer hesitated. 189. Roland raised his hand again. The auctioneer looked around. 189,000. Any more? The developer lowered his card. The hammer came down. Roland Pike held the winning bid. Eli stood beside the porch with his hands folded over the top of his cane. He watched Roland sign the papers, then walk across the frost toward the barrels. "You keeping them?" Eli asked. Roland put one hand on the nearest blue barrel. The plastic was cold beneath his palm. "Every one I can use. Some are cracked. I'll fix them." The auction noise faded behind them. A truck door slammed. Someone laughed near the machine shed. A horse stamped inside the trailer. Roland looked up at the eastern field. "You know," he said, "I used to think this place looked unfinished." Eli watched a crow lift from the fence post. "It was unfinished." Roland nodded. Then he looked toward the grassed waterway, the old barn, and the row of barrels that had once made him laugh. "I didn't buy the creek frontage," he said. "I bought the way the water moves." Eli turned toward him. Roland shrugged. "Land like this is getting harder to find." That was the part nobody had expected. Roland had not bought Mercer Hollow to tear it apart. He had bought it because he knew what the farm could do when rain came hard. The barrels had not made the land valuable by themselves. Years of attention had Will Rogers once said, "The farmer has to be an optimist, or he wouldn't still be a farmer." Eli Mercer was not optimistic because he expected easy years. He'd seen drought turn ponds to dust, rain strip soil from a hillside, and markets take a good harvest and leave a bad price behind. His optimism was quieter. It was the decision to put something in the ground before he knew exactly how it would turn out. It was the patience to slow water before the water gathered speed. It was the humility to learn from an old bulletin, a retired cabinet maker, a grandfather with a pencil, and even a neighbor who had laughed. The barrels were never the real harvest. The real harvest was the habit of looking closely. The field did not become strong in one season. The creek did not become clear because of one storm. No single barrel could hold back a flood, but a row of small decisions, made carefully and repeated for years, had changed what happened when the rain came. Most people saw foolish blue barrels beside an old barn. Eli saw water before it gathered. Speed, and Roland finally saw the same thing. Have you ever been doubted for doing something small, slow, or different only to see it matter later? Tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. And subscribe for more true-to-life rural stories about patience, family, and the quiet wisdom hidden in plain sight.